The Harm I've Done, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. The first time I took revenge on Malcolm Peters, I have to admit, I regretted it. Not that he didn't deserve it, you understand. There was definitely justification for what I did, but somehow it felt awkward, staining, and wrong. It wasn't even really about him, or any concern for how my actions would have affected him. Rather, it was more about me, the way that taking those actions made me feel. That first time, the pleasure in revenge was momentary, and pretty soon I began to feel regret at having debased myself, allowing myself to be dragged down to that level. There had been enough of that sort of thing in our family already. The second time, the final time, I felt no remorse. What happened, happened. Nothing can be done about it now, and of course there is no way to prove that I or Chaco had anything to do with it. I first met Peters in the summer, and under the most unglamorous of circumstances. Taking the job at the burger joint hadn't really been a choice, but a necessity. It's funny, but even now I remember as a kid visiting the place and watching the staff. Teenagers sprinting from one task to another whilst disgruntled customers on the other side of the counter screamed at them. I remember thinking that I would hate to do that job, to spend my days caked in grease and sweat. A speckling of tiny fat burns lining my forearms from where the burgers or the fryers had spat and seared the skin. I remember thinking that I would hate to be forced by the requirements of my job to take that abuse from customers. To turn back to their foul-mouthed tirades at the close of an 8-hour shift and smile falsely, wishing my tormentor a nice day and wishing him to come again, even though I really wish they'd never visit again in their life. Even as a child, I recognized hard work and understood injustice. What I did not have a firm grip on was economics, and how in years to come a lack of funds would force me to don one of those hideous uniforms and learn to smile politely whilst also biting my tongue. They say that money is the root of all evil. If that were really true, then my mother and I would be saints by now, as we spent most of my childhood in appalling poverty. When a parent died in the books I read at the local library, the son or daughter always inherited a fortune. Relatives were always dropping dead and providing the protagonists with unexpected windfalls in the form of property or riches. All of my grandparents and uncles were back in the old country, so there was no prospect of that for me, and when my father died, all he left us was debt. Debt that was to be paid to some deeply shady characters. The first time they beat me, in an attempt to prompt my mother into paying, I was 14, and I didn't understand it. I understood the pain, all right. I was in bed for a week afterwards, nursing a broken wrist, cracked ribs, and severe cuts and bruises. What I didn't understand was how she could give them what she didn't have. How could they expect her to? Why was she responsible for the debts my father had amassed? It didn't seem fair, because it wasn't. On top of the physical pain of the whole thing, there was the worry. Worry that it might happen again, that next time they might not stop at a beating, or worse, that it might not be me who was the victim. When they finished beating me that time, when I was lying curled in the fetal position on the sidewalk, a shrill voice from somewhere above told me that I should consider myself lucky. That usually, Marco got one of his workers to do this sort of stuff, and that I was privileged to have received the beating from him personally. I was not grateful, particularly as it was a service I was expected to pay for. For taking the trouble to kick me senseless personally, Marco added 10% to our debt. My mother and I never discussed the things she had to do to get that money, though we both know what they were. All I can say is that by the time my wounds had healed, my mother had a lot of new bruises and wounds, some visible, some not. She also had enough cash to pay the debt. She told me one night after work, I had been sitting at the table removing the stitches our neighbour had inserted into the gash above my eyebrow. Nobody had the money for hospitals, but Tina had been a nurse in a previous life and did a fair job. The wound was hardly scarring at all. Mother had come home, placed her purse beside the water bowl tinged a rusty brown red with blood, and sighed deeply. "I have what we owe," she said, as if either of us actually owed the bastard anything, before adding in a muted half-whisper, "It's finished." I had expected that to be it. The last time she would ever need to do it, the last time she would leave at 9 p.m. and not come back till 3, the last time I would hear her groaning with pain as she moved or quietly sobbed downstairs. And yet, the night after she paid Marco, after she handed over the stack of notes she had collected for months in a cigar box she kept under the loose floorboard, and placed them into his hands, the same hands he had used to beat me senseless weeks earlier. Still, she went out. I didn't understand it. What need was there now? One night, I confronted her about it and tried to explain that she could stop now, that we had paid Marco and it was over. My mother simply smiled, and sweeping back my hair from my eyes, revealing as she did so the scar above them, she shook her head. "I still need money for Charco," she said, still smiling. "I paid off your father's debts, but I haven't given Marco what I owe him. But he'll get it soon enough. In time, they all get what's owed." A week later, my mother came home at 5, hours later than usual. Unbeknownst to her, I had made a habit of getting up around 10 minutes to 3 so as to be awake when she came home. I wanted to know that she was back and safe. When she hadn't returned by 4:30 a.m., I began to panic. Eventually, though, I did hear the key in the lock, and while lying in bed, I silently listened for her footsteps entering the hallway and the sound of her shoes on the hard surface of the torn linoleum floor. Instead of those sounds, however, instead of waiting downstairs, trying to clear her head and force the night's memories out before she attempted to sleep, or sobbing quietly as she so often did, I heard her come straight up the stairs, hurriedly, almost as if she were in a panic to get there, and with little concern about the noise it made or the possibility of waking me, something she usually avoided at all costs, though, of course, I was often only pretending to be asleep. At first, I thought she was going to burst into my room and scold me for still being awake that night, but instead, she turned right and headed directly for the bathroom and began filling the bath. Worried that perhaps she had been hurt, or that something had happened to her that made her want to scrub her skin till it glowed red as she had a few weeks before, I lifted myself out of bed and on tiptoed feet slowly crossed the hallway from my room, dodging carefully around the boards that I knew would squeak and give away my movements. I was determined to investigate. What I found was my mother, fully dressed, kneeling and slumped halfway over the side of the bathtub, as if she were bathing an infant or testing the water before she got in. Tears were tumbling gently down her cheeks, and yet she was smiling, caressing the surface of the water with a dreamy, wistful motion, as if lost in a world entirely removed from our own. Eventually, taken aback by this strange scene, I took a misstep. The floorboard creaked loudly, and all at once the dream was shattered. My mother turned to where I was standing and fixed her eyes on me. She scolded me for being out of bed at this hour, telling me to get back to my room and go to sleep. When I attempted to ask what she was doing, her voice went up another octave, and I instantly thought better of inquiring. Instead, I did return to my room, but I did not sleep. Rather, I lay awake wondering why my mother had placed what looked to me like mud and dead leaves on the surface of the water, and a small male Barbie doll into the bottom of the bath. Why she caressed that doll ever so softly, and why the entire scene made my blood run cold. The following morning, I heard from a friend that Marco, local kingpin, and my personal tormentor, was dead. It seemed his expensive sports car had somehow spun out of control on a high bend and, crashing through the barrier, had careened headlong into the river. For months after, the local kids would talk about the scene, each claiming to have been or to have known an eyewitness, the lurid details becoming more and more graphic and exaggerated with every retelling. In every version, however, they would tell how Marco's girlfriend, killed by the impact, was slumped to one side in the front seat as the bonnet and front wheels began to disappear below the surface. They told how, in desperation, Marco had climbed into the back seat, thrusting and pounding his fists against the back window until they bled, how he screamed his muffled, unheard cries, trying in vain to escape. One telling, I remember vividly, seemed to concentrate solely on the whites of Marco's eyes, how they bulged and widened as water began to flood in, and the icy, sediment stink of river water swirled around his thighs, his hips, his chest, and the car, with slow, sucking inevitability, started to sink beneath the water. I remember how hearing this story would make my breathing quicken and my chest tighten, as if I too were drowning. Some less believable accounts said that he even shot at the glass in an attempt to shatter it. Some that he succeeded and was clawing his way out, his chest and stomach sliced to pieces by the glass when the car finally pulled him under. Whatever he attempted in reality, it was no good. The car went under with him still inside. Marco drowned before anyone could reach him, his body resting at the bottom of the muddy lake whilst on the surface dead leaves floated, unconcerned. That night, Mother didn't go out. In fact, she never went for that kind of work again. Later, when I was alone in the house, I crept into her room and, removing the floorboards, checked the cigar box where she kept her cash. It was empty of money, but in place of the notes, there was a feather, richly black. It was sticky and caked with some sort of liquid at one end. In addition, there were a tiny bottle of rum, a plastic ziplock in which a quantity of dirt and leaves had been placed, and, perhaps, most horrifically, what looked to me like a preserved alligator's foot. When I brought up the topic of Marco's death a few days later, she gave me a strange, sideways look, partly of suspicion, and partly, I thought, of sorrow or anger. Whatever it was as cold and hard as I ever saw my mother's face, usually so full of warmth and light. Speaking on the subject, she said extraordinarily little, except that Marco had finally gotten what was owed. It was then that I began to suspect two things. Firstly, that my mother would never speak on this topic again, and secondly, that the old woman we called Chaco had far more ready cash than she had at the start of the week. Unfortunately, she was the only one with money, and Marco the only one getting what was owed. Over the next few years, it seemed there wasn't a bill paid on time, a neighbour we didn't owe money to, or a bank that would give us credit. My mother worked, one job at the convenience store and the other at night as a cleaner, but even those two wages combined were not enough, especially because every time one of those pay packets came in, part of it went under the floorboards, at first into the cigar box, then 2 boxes, and finally into a suitcase. Money placed beneath the boards never came out again. Not for rent, not for bills, not even for food, and God knows we could have used it a few times when the third day of soup wasn't filling our bellies. Still, the money was never touched. That, we both knew, was my college fund, saved over years, and still, it wasn't enough. But it helped. With a scholarship, hardship bursary, and the money I had saved myself, I had just enough to pay tuition fees for my 3-year course. For everything else, I needed a job. Mother's health deteriorated a good deal during my last years at high school, and by the time I graduated she wasn't able to work anymore. So it was that Aged 16 on my first day legally allowed to work, I started my job at the burger joint, putting up with the shitty conditions and abusive customers in exchange for a check that would buy food, books, and pay at least some of the rent. And though I hated the work itself, I had to say that to some extent I felt grateful. I had a job, a steady wage, and the prospect, however dim, of a better life once I graduated. Plus, the job wasn't so bad. Until, that is, the day that Malcolm arrived. Then things took a nosedive, and fast. One of the few things they don't tell you in the interview for most burger joints is that your duties will extend far beyond salting fries, taking orders, and the obligatory flipping of burgers. They never mention the fact that most burger joints have a public toilet and that the franchise owners have no intention of paying additional cleaning staff to deal with the mess made by the general public. To this day, I have always thought there was at least a faint tinge of racism in the way these jobs were allocated. It seemed there was never a shift I worked during which I wouldn't at some point have my hand down a toilet scrubbing. It was unpleasant work, I won't lie. And at least once I butted heads with management over their wish for me to pick up and dispose of the used needles that were often left in there without protective equipment. It was the most vocal I had ever been in opposition to management, and for almost 2 weeks I was terrified that they might terminate my contract. Eventually, though, they returned with protective gloves and a sharps kit. It really was the tiniest of small victories. I now had the right protection, but it was still my name that invariably appeared on the roster to do the job, more so since I spoke up. That isn't even to mention the revolting aspects of the job. Why grown men and women would sometimes feel the need to spread shit over the walls of the cubicles like some cross between a dirty protest and a Jackson Pollock painting was beyond me. Sometimes people would make the decision to lay whatever they had to directly next to the toilet itself, as if they preferred to crap straight onto the floor than to sully themselves by using a toilet seat someone else had peed on. And of course it would be my job to clean away whatever they deposited. My least favourite part, though, was the trough. Though the toilets had a single urinal on the far wall, the gents also had a trough, a long stainless steel surface to pee against, below which was a catchment area, a gutter with a plug hole at one end. What annoyed me most about cleaning this part of the toilet was the gum. For some reason, it was the habit of many men to dispose of their chewing gum by spitting it directly into this gutter, often allowing it either to drift on the small stream of urine and water down to the plug hole, or actually take the time to amuse themselves by using the pressure of their own stream to pee the wad of gum down to the other end, like it was some kind of Olympic sport. What never seemed to occur to these urinal athletes was that the plug at the end had a grate over it. Their gum was never, ever going to simply fall down the pipe and be flushed away. Rather, it would come to rest in that grate and would remain there, accumulating and sticking to the other piss-soaked masses of gum until a filthy, globulous pile built up. This pile would have to be removed regularly, or else it would block the flow of water into the hole and cause the trough to overflow. Removed, that is, by hand. And so it was that every day of my working life, whilst employed under the auspices of that particular burger chain, I would enter the gents' toilets and after mopping and sometimes chipping away whatever delights the creative customers had left for me in the stalls, would then have to fish out various cuds of chewing gum from the small river of piss. The worst aspect of this job was the actual touching of the gum. The slippery sheen of the wad as multiple pieces, often in various colours and retaining some ghost of their flavoured scent, balled together, and beneath the pressure of the fingers would leak some form of juice onto the hands. It was enough to make me retch. So, as you can imagine, I was less than impressed when one afternoon, whilst fishing a particularly large mass of gum from the trough, I turned to find a red-haired man in an expensive-looking suede jacket standing there and watching me. He had entered the toilets despite the sign explaining that they were closed for cleaning, and seemed to be observing with some fascination the process of gum removal. From my position, kneeling next to the trough, I explained that the toilets were closed for the time being, but that I would only be a few more minutes. In response to this, the man smiled a weird, crooked smile and winked at me. Then he calmly walked up to the other end of the trough, took out his manhood, and proceeded to relieve himself into it. I eyed him cautiously, wondering whether he might be hard of hearing or perhaps of understanding, and with the ball of gum still in my hand, rose to my feet and dumped it into the black bag, shaking my head. Then it happened. Without taking his eyes off me, the man slowly and deliberately spat his gum into the trough and then proceeded to pee it along to the end where I was standing. Again, winking as he did up his zip, he nodded toward where it had come to rest before adding finally, "You missed a piece," and grinning broadly. It was a small thing. Liberty and an insult, no doubt, but not so offensive that I should have swung for him there and then, but by God I wanted to. I wanted to run across and slap the smile right off his face, so hard that it stuck to the wall opposite. Instead, I simply reached into the trough and picked out the offending piece of gum. "You think that's clever, do you?" I asked in my best condescending voice, though at my age and having just been forced by my station in life to fish a man's deliberately spat gum out of his piss, it seemed a little hollow. "I think it's your fucking job and that you should shut up and get on with it," he said, still smirking and turning toward the door. Oh, how I wanted to hit him. As it turned out, that would have been an awfully bad idea, for when I went downstairs a few minutes later and having disposed of the bags and thoroughly washed my hands, returned to my shift, I was introduced to the same smirking face that I had wished so hard to have punched. Malcolm Peters was my new manager. I don't know if it was intended as hazing, some form of initiation ritual, or punishment for having talked back, but for the 6 hours that remained of my shift, Malcolm Peters made my life hell. He gave me every filthy, disgusting job he could come up with, cleaning sections of machinery and unseen corners of the restaurant and its surroundings that hadn't been touched in years. At one point he had me standing inside the dumpster with a spray bottle and a small scrubbing brush, cleaning out the inside because he claimed it was unhygienic to have a dirty dumpster within 200 yards of the restaurant, even though the trash cans were kept in an entirely separate area. During the shift, I said nothing. I kept my cool because I needed to keep my job. As I left that night, however, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the chunk of piss-drenched gum I had fished from the urinal and retained for the purpose, and without a moment's hesitation, quietly spread it all over the back of Malcolm's suede jacket, hanging on a hook in the corridor. Believe it or not, for a day or so, I felt bad about that. By the end of the week, I didn't. That Friday, at the start of my shift, Malcolm called me into his office. He asked me to take a seat, and after some excruciating chit-chat, he asked me where I was really from. When I replied that I was American, he simply laughed. A weird, scoffing laugh that was half amusement and half spitting, but which confirmed to me instantly that he suspected me of ruining his coat. On the desk in front of him, he had placed a small brown paper folder that I instantly recognized as my file with the company, on account of my name being printed in the top corner. Without saying anything else, he lifted a sheet of paper from the folder and, examining it, said, "You live with your mother, right?" I nodded, and he mirrored the nod, pursing his lips in a strange, duck-like expression somewhere between consideration and disgust. "And where is she really from?" he asked, placing down the page and looking me directly in the eye. I didn't respond, which was fortunate, as Malcolm clearly had more to say. "Because," he went on, "it's worth remembering that I have your file, so I have your home address, and if the authorities happened to ask, then I would have to tell them where you and your mum lived. You know, just in case they wanted to check her paperwork and make sure that wasn't one of those illegals in the country without permission. Now, I'm not saying that I would call them myself, although obviously I could if I was worried, just that if they did happen to ask, well, I'd have to tell them, wouldn't I?" then your mom would be sent back to whatever dark corner of the earth it is that she came from." He again smiled at this, though I did not see anything amusing about the situation. I rose from the chair and made my way to the door. "Just bear it in mind, son," added Malcolm with a laugh. "And by the way, you're on toilet duty first thing, so you'd better grab a mop." I left the room without a word. I had been threatened before. I knew that most times people didn't have the nerve to follow through with what they said, but I also knew that Malcolm was just the type of asshole who would. Whether it was racism, an instant dislike, or some odd notion of vengeance that motivated him, I wasn't sure. What I did know was that I needed to look for another job, and quick. In the meantime, the less I had to do with Malcolm Peters, the better. I decided that I would ask to be transferred to another shift pattern, shifts when another manager was supervising, and the two of us would not cross paths. Whilst I looked for another job, I intended to avoid the man as much as possible, to keep our little tit-for-tat game at a stalemate so that nobody would get hurt. Unfortunately, Malcolm took that decision out of my hands. When I arrived home that evening, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table sobbing. Despite it being mid-March, she had a woolen hat pulled down over her ears. I rushed to her side and asked her what the matter was, terrified that somehow someone had figured out a connection between her and Marco, that someone had hurt or threatened her. For a moment I wondered if Malcolm had decided to call the authorities. After all, it was true that he did know my address. As it turned out, Malcolm had used that information, but in a vastly different way. Around 9 o'clock, whilst I was still working and long after my manager to mentor had left for the night, my mother had received a knock at the door. Opening it cautiously, she had been confronted by what she described as a middle-aged white man with red hair. The man said nothing, but with a single action reached forward and slapped my mother on the top of her head before turning and calmly walking away. Too shocked to even react, my mother had recoiled and slammed the door shut. It was only a few moments later that she realized what he had done. In striking my mother on the top of her head, the man had pushed into her dreadlocked hair a large deposit of chewing gum. The gum had tangled in the locks, stretching and knotting into the hair, sticking and matting several locks together. My mother had screamed and tried to pull the gum out, but it had been no use. A few hours later, seeing no other option, my mother visited our neighbour Tina, and she had the dreadlocks she had been growing for almost 15 years cut from her head, and the remaining hair shaved down, so that now she was completely bald. Removing her hat at the kitchen table, she showed me the results of the attack and shuddered to tell me that every time she had looked into the mirror, she saw the bastard smirking. I was incandescent. I swore that the next day I would walk into work and beat the son of a bitch to death with my bare hands. As I raged, however, my mother simply sat quietly shaking her head. "Sometimes," she said, once I had finally calmed down, "you must pay in money. Sometimes the satisfaction is enough. Our community looks after its own. You will go to work tomorrow, but you will say nothing. There are other ways." From her pocket, she took a small Ziploc bag in which were the locks that had been shorn from her head, each one still intact, twisted together by the gum so that they rested inside the plastic like some giant black spider. "To make things happen," she said with a sigh, "you need something of theirs. Skin, hair, a piece of their clothing, saliva." She turned and looked at me with a hollow, empty hardness in her eyes that I had only seen once before. "It works like this," she said, placing the hair on the table so that it rested between us like a physical manifestation of the problem. "Once you have got something of theirs, you give it to Charco. She then gives you 2 objects. All of that nonsense you see in the films about voodoo dolls is just rubbish. What she gives you can be anything. An egg, a mango, a piece of wood, anything. The point is, you must do things correctly. I nodded, knowing all the while that doing things correctly would make me complicit in something that was likely to have dire consequences, just as I knew that my mother had no papers and that a single phone call would send her back to a place where she would likely be killed within weeks. I nodded a single gesture that showed both agreement and consent. My mother went on quietly. When she gives you these two things, one must be given to the subject, put into their possession somehow so that it then belongs to them. Once that is done, whatever you do to the other will happen to them. Give them one egg and go home to fry the other. Give them a mango and go home to stamp on the other. As surely as the sun rises, they will be burnt or crushed. Years later, my mother would tell me how she paid half of the money she saved to Chaco, the other half to a local girl whom she paid to slip a doll into the boot of Marco's car. Sitting at the kitchen table that night, she said she would see Chaco in the morning, and that by afternoon I would know what to do. By the end of the week, Malcolm Peters was dead. The papers said it was a freak accident, that in the past 50 years only 4 people had died in the United States in accidents involving escalators, still fewer in the horrific manner Malcolm had. It seems he had fallen through a faulty panel at the top of the mechanical stairs and was pulled by his legs into the machinery, his body mangled flesh, minced beyond recognition. There was nothing anyone could do, and though an investigation into the company manufacturing the escalator would obviously take place, it was really nobody's fault. No one but mine, my mother's, and Chaco's. For I couldn't help but feel it was more than a coincidence that the strange old woman who lived in our community and gave tonics for illnesses and prayed to strange gods should give me so specific an instruction only days earlier. Having received the bag with my mother's hair and the gum chewed by Malcolm, she had in turn given me 2 brand new sticks of gum. One piece, she told me, to slip into Malcolm's coat, the other to do with as I pleased. Later that day, I put the gum into Malcolm's pocket, whilst the other piece I chewed for hours. This has been The Harm I've Done, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.